I used to fall asleep with price charts glowing like a second sun on the wall, lines of green pretending to be certainty, candles as tall as confidence, and my pulse climbing step for step with the market. I told myself I was building a future on mathematics and discipline, that my investment thesis was sober, that my risk management was a hard shell around soft hopes. I said words like liquidity, custody, cold storage, and I kept a notebook where every trade had a reason and every reason had a footnote. The screen called me in the morning like a bell and blessed me before bed like a prayer. When I scrolled through the portfolio and saw the numbers leap, I heard, almost physically, the click of handcuffs falling off my life. Bitcoin crossed a line and I crossed a boundary inside myself, the one that separates enough from more. I told the people I loved that this was the year we would breathe easier, that the house would grow quieter with freedom, that the weight of credit and debt would loosen, and the budget would stop bleeding red. I made cappuccinos with steady hands and grocery lists with flaunted generosity. I bought a second-hand jacket and felt it sit like armor, snug with self-approval. I met a partner who spoke my language, who said we could pool capital into a closed fund and arbitrate spreads invisible to the untrained eye, stacking reliable income while the rest of the world argued about luck. We promised ourselves insurance against panic. We drafted rules. We wrote passwords on paper. We nodded to the old gods of cold wallets and diversified exposure. I told myself this was not greed, it was precision. I bought a whiteboard and drew arrows toward a future where passive income seeped like sunlight into every corner of our routine, where the fund paid the mortgage and the mortgage paid back time. Nights smelled like coffee and ambition. I pressed buy when the chart dipped and congratulated my restraint. I pressed buy when the chart rose and congratulated my courage. I pressed buy because the story made sense and the story sounded like me. I watched social feeds brag about portfolios 10x over, and I reminded myself that the stock market taught patience, that startups taught endurance, and that cryptocurrencies taught you to keep your private keys in your head. When I called the bank and asked about refinancing the credit line, my voice was stone. I spoke of income projections and collateral like a person with a plan. On the kitchen table lay a folded piece of paper titled Family Budget, and I put my hand on it like a sacred text. I moved expenses into categories, reduced subscription noise, calculated runway. I joked to myself that I was running my life like a startup with a quiet, sensible CFO living inside my skull. At night I stood by the window and felt taller than the city, as if charts had lifted me by the shoulders. I saw the future like clear ice. I promised to slow down once we crossed a certain number that hovered in my head like a finish line. That line moved each week in tiny increments that felt rational. I told myself that true risk management was refusing to be afraid of growth. On the day I looked at my account and saw 7 figures, I stared as if it were a lake in winter, beautiful and hard and ready to hold my weight. I took a slow breath and told myself I had finally engineered a life where money would stop being the loudest voice in the room. I told myself I had earned my peace. Winter did not announce itself with a storm. It came as a draft sneaking under the door. A rumor about a failed lender, a thread about insolvent exchanges, a chart that slipped and didn't bounce. I swallowed unease like a vitamin and said corrections were healthy. The partner called with a tone I didn't recognize and said we might need to move some liquidity. Later, I would understand that move as an evacuation, but that morning I brewed coffee and told myself we were agile. The portfolio began to look like a curtain slowly lowering on a stage, graceful at first, then accelerated by its own weight. My notebook filled with reasons that sounded like weather reports, remote and slightly theatrical. The closed fund needed collateral to maintain positions that had been a quiet engine of profit when the market was kind. Now the engine demanded fuel we didn't have. The first liquidation was a bad dream, a red bar that swallowed weeks of effort with a single click. I ate toast that morning without tasting it and told myself the worst part of pain was the imagination it fed. Phone calls became meetings, and meetings became excuses, and excuses became the language of a room where trust ran out of oxygen. When I looked across the table at the person who used to finish my sentences about basis trades and covered calls, I saw a stranger calculating a self-preservation budget I wasn't invited to see. I remember the sound of a teaspoon against the coffee mug and the faint tremble in my own wrist. I remember the email that reclassified responsibility into a shape that left me holding more than I could carry. Betrayal looks boring on paper. It reads like a clause you missed and a date that passed with a polite reminder. It feels like stepping onto a stair that isn't there. I asked the insurer if the policy we had would shield us from force majeure, and the answer was a paragraph that smiled while saying no. I reached for the confident words I used to wear like a suit and found them hanging loose. Bitcoin kept falling as if gravity had redrafted the rules, and even the coins I loved for their stories turned into symbols of stubbornness. The charts were a steady rain against a thin roof, and inside the house, damp crept into the corners. Calls came from the bank, voices that used to greet me like a valued client now reading from a list of concerns set to a patient metronome. I paid what I could, rearranged the budget, sold the jacket that had felt like armor, and stared at spreadsheets until the columns looked like prison bars. I cooked cheap pasta, grated cheese like a small celebration, and ate standing up because the chair had become a place for regret. The closed funds shared wallet moved in ways I didn't approve, and the approvals I sent into the darkness felt like signing receipts for furniture I never ordered. The partner vanished behind a careful silence that sounded like legal advice. I closed the laptop and listened to the hum of the refrigerator as if it were the last loyal machine. I thought about stocks for the first time in months, the boredom and humility of index funds, the way the stock market teaches you to be a person instead of a gambler. I remembered how I used to mock slow money and felt ridiculous in the mirror. I took a walk without counting steps and realized my muscles were as tight as uncashed checks. The wind was a ledger against my face, itemizing everything I hadn't wanted to feel. A letter arrived about the mortgage. A number I used to ignore as background suddenly wore steel shoes. I cleared the table, spread bills, and placed coins in a row like chess pieces I could still move. I watched the portfolio again at midnight, not as a believer but as a witness, and I understood the emotion I had misdiagnosed for so long. It wasn't confidence. It was euphoria wearing a good haircut. When the house left my life, it did not slam the door. It drifted away like steam from a kettle. One signature led to another, and suddenly my footsteps didn't belong to any hallway I recognized. The bed felt like a guest room even when my body begged to collapse. The morning I packed the last box, I found the whiteboard with arrows that used to point at freedom, and I wiped it clean with the sleeve of a sweater that had seen too many glowing nights. The grocery store hired me for the midnight shift because my voice sounded honest when I said I needed hours more than pride. The first night I rolled a metal cart down an aisle. I remembered the weight of a phone dissolving in my hand as alerts stacked on the screen like unpaid debts. I stacked canned tomatoes with a concentration I had once reserved for decoding funding rates. I lifted boxes with the same care I used for private keys. I watched people wander through fluorescent light with small lists and quiet faces, and I felt oddly held by the simple math of shelves and labels. Breaks were short enough to feel like penance. In the back room, I sipped tea from a thermos and counted the breaths between the clock's prompts. The phone still rang with phrases like past due and grace period and options, and my answers grew shorter as if protecting air in my lungs. Budget became not a tab but a backbone. Debt became not an abstraction but a neighbor I could not avoid. I learned to cook rice well, to stretch protein without self-pity, to make soup that tasted like comfort instead of surrender. On days off, I tackled the paperwork I had once assumed would be handled by the momentum of success. I made lists of small wins, a bill negotiated down by persistence, a call that ended with a human chuckle instead of a script, a line in the ledger that finally marked zero. I walked past my reflection in store windows and studied the version of me that was no longer a paper millionaire, but a person with tolerances measured in endurance. I still watched charts sometimes to understand the weather of a world that had once been my home, and I felt the ghost of addiction tap my shoulder with promises of a bounce. I stayed put. I thought about passive income and heard the phrase in a new register. I thought about startups and remembered how many of them are small storms that never cross a coastline. I rehearsed apologies in my head that no one had asked for, especially to the people who had followed my certainty into waters they did not know how to swim. I kept my voice level when the bank mentioned credit restructuring, and I kept my temper when I read a headline about an exchange clawback. The closed fund dissolved into a cloud of emails that made legal sense and human nonsense. The betrayal was complete not because of the money, but because of the silence that followed it, a vacuum shaped like a person. I visited the cold kitchen of a smaller apartment each night and learned that light from a single lamp can be enough if you sit close. I wrote on scraps of paper like I was rehearsing my life in fragments and then piecing it back together. Regret arrived in waves at first and then in tides I could read, and eventually it became a weather system that still delivered rain but stopped spinning hurricanes. The winter ended not because the price recovered, but because I did. The spring did not come with fireworks. It came with a series of reasonable mornings that asked reasonable things of me. I woke early without a screen dragging me forward, brewed tea in a kettle that whistled like an old friend, and took a short walk before the city rustled. I learned to be proud of a different spreadsheet, the one where expenses aligned with reality and the margin of error was patience. Income was honest again even if it arrived slowly, and that slowness taught me to savor a stability I used to consider boring. When I placed items on shelves at midnight, I thought of all the invisible hands that keep a community running, how the economy is not just numbers but the way cartons are lifted and trucks are unloaded, and the way a tired face softens when the receipt shows less than expected. I paid down debt the way one shovels snow, steadily and without ceremony. I made peace with the stock market as a teacher of humility instead of a contest. I built an emergency fund that looked small and stubborn, and I protected it with an instinct I used to reserve for passwords. I turned off notifications that measured my worth in ticks. I called the bank and heard respect return as if from the end of a long corridor. I took a free online course about risk management and recognized my old mistakes printed in neat slides, and I felt grateful to see them outside my body where they could be studied instead of endured. I gave away a few gadgets I had bought in my season of abundance and discovered the soft relief of owning less. I cooked simple meals and ate them slowly. I let silence be a room I could live in instead of a punishment. I do not pretend that I am glad for the betrayals or grateful for the losses, but I am strangely relieved to have walked out of a story that was going to end worse had I stayed. I understand the gravity of leverage now, the seduction of models that explain everything until they don't, the way a portfolio can become a mirror that lies. I remember the warm arrogance of planning for passive income that would coddle me into a kinder future, and I study the present instead, day by day, budget category by budget category, hour by hour. I still carry a small ache for the house that is no longer mine, and for the version of me who believed that cleverness could outpace risk. But in the grocery aisle at midnight, when I move a pallet jack like a quiet ship through a sea of boxes, I feel steadier. I know how many steps it takes to reach the loading dock. I know the weight of a crate by the first pull. I know I will pour hot tea from a thermos at 3 in the morning and watch the steam and feel content in a way that is not loud but is mine. Sometimes I see a chart on a television above the registers and a green candle will flare like memory. I nod to it as one nods to an old neighbor and keep working. I still invest, but in slow ways, small contributions set to automatic, a reluctant trust in the stock market as a long, quiet river. I learned to ensure the things that matter in a way that is boring and real. I rebuilt a relationship with work that does not require applause to feel dignified. I keep a notebook again, not for trades but for recollections, the tiny details that a life is built from, the squeak of a cartwheel that needs oil, the scent of laundry from the machines at dawn, the rare customer who says thank you like a blessing. I am no longer measuring myself against a number that can change while I sleep. I am measuring myself by how I breathe through uncertainty, by the shape of a day I am proud to have lived. On the nights when memories shove their way in, I walk to the kitchen and stand by the sink, and the cold tile does not frighten me anymore. I pour water, hold the glass with both hands, and understand that my hands are enough. The story I used to tell about wealth has changed tense. It is not a prophecy anymore. It is a lesson that tastes like honesty. It ends here, not with triumph banners or with ruin, but with a soft gratitude for the ordinary. I lost everything in a single crypto winter, and in the thaw I found something stubborn and simple that I had dropped a long time ago. I found a self that can go to work on a hard night, count change without shame, close the store with care, step into the air, feel the hush of the city, and trust that morning will keep its promise. Thanks listening this story. Now I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's see how global our community is. Comment your country down below. Share this story to your friends and leave a like and subscribe for more episodes like this.